Decided to redo a bunch of old videos, and I'm going to do a compression test on this vehicle. It was on the highway running fine, and then all of a sudden lost power, died, coasted to the side of the road. I took a quick look already to see if it looks like cam and crank timing is good. It does appear to be. I've already checked for spark, which it has. I've already checked for fuel, which it also has. But when it's cranking, it cranks very fast. It does not sound like the engine's healthy. So we need to figure out why. Now, I want to be able to crank this engine without it starting to run a compression test. There's a couple ways I can do this. First way I can do it is to use the key to turn the engine over and disable the spark and the fuel. To disable spark and fuel, you may be pulling relays or unplugging fuses or disconnecting coils or whatever, okay? The other way to do it is actually to figure out how to jump the starter so that you can rotate the engine by the starter without the key. This vehicle is pretty easy to do. It's got this harness right here, and simply unplug that like that. And then I just happen to have another harness that's off a similar vehicle that I can plug in. Okay, just like that. Now that it's plugged in, I can use this terminal on the positive terminal of the battery, crank the engine. And you may have heard there that the engine's cranking very fast, all right? That really does tell me that there's a mechanical issue that needs to be addressed. I already had a good suspicion of that before I checked fuel and spark, but go ahead and check everything. Follow a good diagnostic routine. So the first thing I'm going to do is get all the plug wires off. And they've already been off once, so they're coming out pretty easy. I'm going to kick those out of the way. All right. Now I want to be able to open the throttle completely, because if I'm not opening the throttle completely, I limit airflow into the engine, and that can give me a false compression reading. If I don't have a full amount of air passing the throttle body, my compression values are going to be lower, simply because I'm not taking in as much air as I could be for that compression cycle. So to get the throttle open completely, we got to get this cover out of the way. Now I can open the throttle up. Next up, get a spark plug out. I do one at a time. You could pull all of them out if you want, but I don't like to do that just because a lot of times you're cranking the engine over with all the plugs out. It's spitting things at you, a little bit of fuel, a little bit of oil, just garbage. So I just do one at a time. It's not going to affect your readings at all. We get the plug out. Okay, looking at it, it's not looking terrible, but it doesn't look great. All right, so set the plug to the side and grab the adapter for the compression gauge. Now, compression gauge, you're gonna buy one, borrow one, whatever, rent one, pretty common, pretty readily available. Auto parts stores a lot of times have them for rent. Okay, this is the gauge itself. What I'm wanting to see is I want to look very carefully and pay attention to that first crank, okay? Because it's that initial jump that really tells me a lot about the health of the vehicle's engine. If it jumps up pretty good, say it goes to 100 there, all right, and then it slowly rises, that's actually not necessarily a bad thing, because what that means is that when you initially crank that engine over, it has pretty good squeeze. But let's say it came up to 20 and then 40 and then 60 and then 80 and eventually worked its way up. What that means is that the engine is worn out enough that it's not really making good squeeze, okay? So we're looking at that initial jump and then of course our final number. The higher the number, the better off, but you're going to reach a point where the number is only going to go so high. And just because you have maybe a lower number, say 100, 110, that doesn't necessarily mean the compression is bad. What we need to do is look at each cylinder and then compare the readings to all of them, okay? So let's say I've got 120, 120, 110, 120. That's okay. But 120, 120, 60, 120 would not be. So it's that comparison that we're looking for. Once the adapter's threaded in, we're going to go ahead and connect the gauge like this. Okay. And I'm going to just try to hold both the gauge and the throttle at the same time. So that'll hopefully be captured. And then I'm going to crank it. Okay, so that initial jump was pretty weak. And the compression value sitting there at about 30 pounds is extremely low. All right, so I'm going to disconnect, put that plug back in, and let's go to number 3 cylinder. I'm doing this in opposite order, just kind of to stay out of the way of the camera. So I just did number 4, thread that back in. Not going to worry too much about tightening it, just enough to keep it from blowing garbage out. Okay, let's get number 3 out of there. Okay, number 3 looks about the same as 4, not too bad. The threads are wet from oil, but the plug itself is not real saturated with fuel. There's a little bit, but not a lot. It's not dripping. Okay, and try this again. Same thing. And crank it. Okay. Number 3 is even worse than 4. All right. So if I have just the 2 that are really, really low, then at that point I might say, you know, there's something like a head gasket, cracked head, cracked block, something like that, that's impacting those 2 cylinders. But if I have more than 2, then I really have to start thinking along other lines. And even though the timing looks good on the crank and the cams, this thing really does crank like it's got bent valves. I'm not sure why the valves would be bent, but everything about this just kind of indicates that that's where the problem is. So if I get a 3rd cylinder that's as low as the first 2, extremely unlikely for that to be a cracked head or blown head gasket, and I've really got to start thinking in terms of valve train. Valve train is about the only thing that's really going to give me that kind of a failure that quickly with no warning. Okay. Let's see what happens here. Open. I hope that gauge is coming through pretty good. Okay. Number 3 looks almost identical to number 2. Number 4, surprisingly enough, had the highest compression value. I'm going to stop there. I don't see much point in checking number 1. And I think we're going to go ahead and take a look at cylinder leak down on this thing, really pin this thing down. So that's how you do a compression test. Pretty straightforward, and it can actually tell you quite a bit, but it's not always the last of your diagnostic steps. In this case, we're going to have to do a cylinder leak test as well.